Hello and welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme I'll be talking to NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe and to the man who came up with the apocalyptic Gaia environmental theory. Hold on to your hats. But first, the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown. Last week Mr Brown, of course, played host to the G20 summit and was widely praised for coming up with an agreement which, if it didn't give everyone exactly what they wanted, at least enabled all the countries to sign up and claim victory. But in addition to the G20, we wanted to hear from Mr Brown about other issues facing the globe. So, in a wide-ranging interview, I met Gordon Brown at No. 10 Downing Street to talk about everything from the possible abolition of nuclear weapons to the prospect of peace or otherwise in the Middle East. But we began with that G20 deal. Prime Minister's delight to be with you here at 10 Downing Street.
And happy birthday this week.
Thank you very much.
Our best wishes to you.
Thank you very much indeed. The following G20 and so on, do you feel we have to quote the old howler about the height of the slump has been reached or something, right? But do you think that we've passed the worst point and you're confident that it's going to be better from here on in, or could it get worse?
Well, I think the great thing about the G20 is that we're seeing a new level of international cooperation, global cooperation that we've never seen before. So you have China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Europe and America, Russia, all working together for a common purpose. Now, I think that will make a difference to the speed at which we can get a recovery. Because when countries are working together, there is more confidence and there's a better chance of restructuring our banking system, which is, after all, a global banking system and not just one or two national banking systems. So I'm confident that after the G20, the possibilities for the world working together in other areas are also stronger. Climate change, terrorism, security, all these things as a result of people's understanding that when we come together, we can achieve far more than operating individually.
Are there parts of the world that you think are going to be completely clear of this crisis, or some areas, maybe including Britain, where it's going to be more difficult, harder?
Well, I think we're all affected.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the first global financial crisis. It's the first crisis which is global, that needs a global solution. To restructure banks in one country and still to have bad banks or impaired assets in banks in other countries would mean that you would still have a difficulty about restoring confidence. So what did we agree about the global restructuring of banks? Common principles, required standards, coordination between supervisors, cross-border supervision of financial institutions, transparency in activities, rules for remuneration, rules for tax havens. Now, all these things were agreed, and this is the first time this has ever happened, to be honest. All were agreed at the G20 meeting.
You've got a hell of a lot in there, certainly, in the course of that. And come back in the light of that to the question, do you think we're about to come out of it, or whether it could get a bit worse?
Well, I think a lot depends on the level of international cooperation that is finally delivered. I mean, it's said that if one country takes action on its own, that has half the effect as than if each country took action together. Because we're all importing and exporting to each other, then the fact that you have a coordinated stimulus, a coordinated action around the world, can bring the return of growth faster. Now, what's preventing it at the moment is that we had a banking crisis, then we had a general financial and economic crisis. Now we've got a trade crisis, which is one of the biggest problems, because trade has fallen by the equivalent of 20% in a few months, and that is a big problem that's got to be dealt with. So what happened in the last few months is, and this is why it's affecting all countries, is that exports from all the major trading countries fell dramatically. And now we have got to restore world trade as well as to restore national economic growth. And that's why the trade credits we announced are so important. If you've got what happened, which was really a power cut throughout the banking system, this is not an ordinary crisis. In other words, most problems we've had around the world in the last 50 years have been caused by inflation. This crisis has got very little to do with inflation. It's not caused by high interest rates. It's caused by a failure in the banking system that has denied people credit and then confidence throughout the world. And to rebuild that credit and confidence, we've got to restructure the banking system, but then we've also got to provide real help to people as we go through these difficult times, and that's why the fiscal stimulus is so important. If markets fail, then governments have got a responsibility to take some action.
With the benefit of hindsight, which is so easy and rarely truly available, would you in your 10 years as Chancellor of the Exchequer have done anything different if you'd known what was coming?
Well, I tried after the Asian crisis of 1998 to persuade my international colleagues that we had a real problem about managing the global financial system and the global economy. And we put forward, as Britain, a series of proposals then that I kept trying to alert people to, about the reform of the global financial system, about the transparency and disclosure, the cross-border supervision and everything that is necessary. And I suppose it is regrettable that for 10 years after the Asian crisis, it was difficult for us to persuade other countries that these proposals should be adopted. Now we're actually adopting them. We've got a financial stability board now that's going to look at the cross-border supervision of assets, just been agreed. We've got the rules governing tax havens and remuneration all agreed, but it was difficult a few years ago to persuade people of the importance of these things. So yes, the world should have acted differently. We basically have had global financial flows that have been so rapid and so intense that they've overwhelmed the national systems of regulation in every country. And now we've got to build better national systems, but also there is no gain for doing that unless you also have a global system as well.
And in terms of the reputation of London as a financial centre, do you think that will recover or never be the same again?
People will not move the money to countries they don't think are safe now. I mean, that's one of the lessons of this crisis. If London shows, as I believe it can, with the reforms we're making, that there is a degree of openness and transparency and disclosure, a degree of accountability and probity, then I think we will quickly restore our place. Well, we have the place, and I will quickly entrench our place as one of the great centres of the financial system. So I'm confident that by making the changes quickly, and other countries maybe will not move as quickly as we're moving, we can actually show that London is capable of being a great financial centre for the future.
And would we be better off if we had faced this crisis having joined the euro, or less good?
I don't think being in the euro would have helped us at this stage, and I think we are able to deal with our problems, with our own inflation target, and with the action that the Bank of England has taken, which unfortunately has not been possible in Europe, which is quantitative easing, the bank actually taking a more active role in the economy. And I think that is to our advantage. But of course, in principle, being in the euro is a good idea. In practice, it's always been difficult to see the economies converging.
President Obama had a personal success in his tour of
great success.
Europe and here, etc. And he spoke up for a nuclear-free world. He talked about getting rid of nuclear weapons more than once, obviously. Is that a cue for us to discard Trident and save billions?
No, I don't think so at the moment. I think there are issues here that we've all got to address for the future. Look, what President Obama is saying is what I believe, that if we are to persuade countries like Iran, like Korea, but right round the Arab world, not to proliferate nuclear weapons, then we have got to make an initiative, one, to offer civil nuclear power, and two, to be prepared to reduce our own nuclear weapons. Now, you probably know better than I the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because it was one of the great advances of the time. But the bargain in that treaty was that other countries would not adopt nuclear weapons in return for the holders of nuclear weapons reducing the nuclear arsenals. And I think what President Obama is saying is what really I'm saying here. If we can offer non-proliferators access to civil nuclear power, make the conditions in which it's available to them secure, of course, but in return for them not adopting nuclear weapons, then if we also at the same time reduced our nuclear weapons, we'd show that we were honouring the spirit of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
And you mentioned North Korea there. what can we do about that? I mean, everybody around the world was appalled by their nuclear test that they undertook. What can we do about that?
Well, I expressed the same outrage as other countries did.
Yeah.
And,
universal outrage.
And people understand that this is a serious departure from agreements about non-proliferation. But we've got to isolate those proliferating countries and make sure that they do not have the acquiescence of the rest of the international community. Now, look, we have seen the number of nuclear states rise from the original 5. We have seen others, like South Africa, renounce nuclear weapons. I think it's important to recognise that we're at a quite decisive stage here. From the doubling of nuclear states, you could see a rise that was very big indeed if we saw Iran, North Korea, and then the rest of the Arab world pushed into a position where they thought for status and for protection, they had to adopt nuclear weapons as well. Now that's why this offer is, I think, so important. We are prepared to make available our expertise in civil nuclear power. We're prepared to even provide an enrichment bond or bank where uranium enrichment is done, perhaps in a third country. In return, we would like an agreement that the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty are going to be upheld, that there will be no more nuclear weapon proliferation. And I think this is a big offer to the rest of the world. We'll help you get the benefits of civil nuclear power. At the same time, we will reduce our own nuclear weapons to show that we are serious about reducing the power of nuclear weapons around the world. But we expect no more proliferation, and that's really the nature of the bargain that I think is worth talking about.
And immediately on North Korea, there's not much, I suppose, sanctions or something like that. There's no thought of a military attack on North Korea, is there?
No, and I think they're totally isolated. And I think around the world there's a distaste for what has been done to acquire this nuclear technology. And I think you will see the advances in negotiations over the next few months as we try to get a new non-proliferation treaty that is capable of meeting the legitimate aspirations of countries that they need both their own defence and civil nuclear power, but at the same time not requiring us as a world to go on a new proliferation race, which is, in my view, very, very dangerous. Because you've got another factor now in this nuclear weapons argument. Before we talked about nuclear weapons in the hands of powers, countries, states. Now we've got the additional factor of the potential threat of nuclear weapons in the hands of groups and factions and organised terrorism. So we have got if you like, an additional responsibility to try and avoid the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
That is very important. Did you obviously struck up a very good rapport, as it were, with President Obama. President Obama, summing up that and your relationship, said that you have a great many things in common, including spectacular wives and wonderful children.
Absolutely.
And that's the best thing to have in common, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's one of the greatest things to have in common. He's got young children. I've got young children. You've got to protect them.
I saw the mini house out on the lawn.
That's right. You've got to protect them from the pressures of publicity, and they've got to grow up, as I think President Obama also understands, as ordinary children, not thinking that there's anything special. They've got to get on with their school kids and their friends at school and everything else. So we're trying to give them a more private background.
Do you expect to see, in your lifetime, a non-white British Prime Minister?
I think that's possible, yes, and it's about ability and merit. There should be no discrimination in our country, and I'm very proud that we've got many people who are very, very great representatives of the black community in both our government and our politics.
I would think, actually, President Obama must be rather disappointed with the turnout by NATO in terms of troops on a long or middle term basis.
For
NATO
Afghanistan.
didn't really come up to the right figure, did it?
Well, there's got to be burden sharing, and that's got to increase over time. But there are 42 countries signed up to this coalition. But I think the American government were able to announce, as a result of our discussions, 5,000 more troops were going in for the election period. Europe offered more than people expected. And I think the policing, the training mission for troops, the civilian support for the future are all also important, because you've got to understand, I think, that the Afghan strategy has changed. We've got to complement the military work that we're doing, and I do praise the dedication and professionalism of our troops. All these things are essential for the reconstruction of Afghanistan and for Afghanistan being free of the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda influences.
Yes, I think, talking the Taliban, I think between when we thought we'd beaten the Taliban and when they bounced back, we did underestimate their bounce-back powers, didn't we? They're now more powerful than they've probably ever been.
Well, I think, put it another way, we are now more aware of the connections between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so if you have people pouring over the border or coming over the border into Afghanistan from Pakistan, you've got a problem. And now the strategy is to look at Afghanistan and Pakistan as a whole. And I think that's really, really important, because we know that most of Al-Qaeda's base is in Pakistan, and we know that there is a Pakistan Taliban supporting what's happening in Afghanistan. So to look at these border issues, and also to look at how Pakistan can contribute to the fight against terrorism, is a very important element of this strategy now.
But it's almost an unwinnable war, isn't it? Almost?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I would say is that we have to isolate the Al-Qaeda and Taliban element that is determined to destroy lives and destroy the democracy that Afghanistan has now been building. And we've got to work with the Pakistani authorities to deal with what is a very big terrorist presence in the Fatah and other parts of Pakistan.
Pakistan actually has become more of a worry, hasn't it? Because although its leaders are on the ball in terms of the policies of the West, I mean, it is a powder keg, really, isn't it?
Well, Pakistan's got the problems of an economic set of difficulties at the moment, but also groups of terrorists in their country, operating from their country. And we need all the cooperation that we have with the Pakistani authorities to deal with these problems. And I think it's got an effect on the streets of Britain, because I think people do know that 2/3 of the terrorist plots that we've had to identify and deal with in Britain, either successful or unsuccessful plots, have originated from Pakistan, and clearly instructions being made from leaders in Pakistan rather than in Britain.
What about Iraq? President Obama said how Afghanistan has been starved partially over the deployment it needed by the demands of Iraq, obviously. But other people are saying that after the recent elections and so on, we could actually say that the war in Iraq was a success.
Well, I think what's happened
Do you think it was a success?
Well, I believe it was the right thing to do. I believe we've achieved the objectives we set out only a year and a half ago, which is to make sure that the Iraq government and the Iraq army and the Iraq police are able to run their own country, to bring about a level of civilian support for local government elections, which have been successful, and to make sure that there's a level of economic and social development taking place in Iraq, that people feel that they are part of the future of Iraq, and that people in Iraq feel that Iraq is making progress. Now, these were perhaps more limited objectives than we started with, but these are objectives that are being achieved, and that's why it's possible for us to withdraw our troops in the next few weeks.
David Miliband was saying that you're going to have a comprehensive inquiry after there are no longer any British troops in Iraq. Is that still the plan?
Yeah, I mean, remember, there's been about 4 inquiries into Iraq already. 2 of them done by parliamentary committees, 2 by private individuals. You had the Butler inquiry, and then you had the inquiry into the David Kelly affair, Hutton inquiry. So it's not that Iraq has not been looked at by parliamentary and other committees, but there is a case once the troops come home for looking at how we can review what happened, and we'll talk about that after the troops come home.
And in terms of the developments of the Middle East at the time, obviously Benjamin Netanyahu has announced very clearly over the past few months and so on that he's not really in favour of a two-state solution, along with all the other blows that have gone on, like, for instance, Gaza and all the things. Do you understandably start to despair of there being a solution to that Middle Eastern crisis?
I will never give up on my hope that the Middle East can achieve peace through the creation of a viable Palestinian state side by side with a secure Israel. And I believe that that's what most people who look at this set of problems that have been with us for years want to see. And even though you can be pessimistic about some of the problems we've seen in recent months, such as the terrible events in Gaza, I think you've also got to be optimistic that more and more people are coming to realize that this is not only a key to peace between Israel and Palestine, it is also an important element of building a better Middle East. So it's essential not just to the peace of one part of the region, but essential to the stability of the whole of the region.
And a bit of persuasion will have to go on, but I think Benjamin Netanyahu, while he's a hardliner, he's capable of listening as well, I think, isn't he?
Well, I think the important thing to recognise, I met him in Jerusalem only a few weeks ago and met him with the other leaders of the parties, and I was making it clear to him that while his focus is on Iran, that the way that Iran will not be able to command support from other countries in the region is if we have a Middle East peace settlement. And it's up to Israel also to take the initiative to make it possible for there to be talks that could lead to a Middle East peace settlement. And it's up, obviously, to the Palestinians to come together to make that possible. But I believe there are still signs in the Middle East that show that it is possible to make progress towards that Middle East peace settlement quickly.
What about Russia, Prime Minister? Are you alarmed by Russia in areas like Georgia and so on? How dangerous is that trend, or do you think it's controllable?
Well, I think you've got to look at this issue of the areas around Russia where, in our view, Russia is trying to exercise influence in countries that are free countries. So Georgia and Ukraine have become particular issues in that. But I think you've also got to look at Russia's role in relation to the rest of the world. And I do see signs that Russia wants to join the nuclear disarmament process that President Obama has suggested. We have been working closely with Russia in Iran. They've been an important element to us in the Middle East peace settlement. And so I think, despite all the difficulties we've had with Russia, and you know there are many with the British Council and with our attempt to extradite someone who we believe was responsible for a murder in London, although there have been these difficulties, and these difficulties remain unresolved, I think it's important to recognise that in a new global order where you have less nuclear weapons, you have peace in relation to Iran through there being security for people, and you act in the Middle East, then Russia is important to us in doing so. So we want good relations with Russia. We don't want bad relations with Russia.
I remember the first time I interviewed, just before he became president, after being acting president, back in 2000, Vladimir Putin, and I said, would Russia like to join NATO or whatever? And he said, I don't see why not. And then went on to say that they must be treated in a certain way. Would it make a nonsense of NATO if Russia was a member, or is it desirable?
Well, it's an attempt to come to terms with some of these problems, that we want both peace with Russia, but we recognise that there are differences that still remain, that we've created the NATO-Russia Council, which is an attempt to meet with the Russians to discuss common issues. And I think when President Medvedev announced his foreign policy objectives for Russia, there were certain things we could agree with and certain things that we would find difficult. So I think it's more about discussion between NATO and Russia about where we can find common ground. That is the next stage of the process. I think that's really where you are.
Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David.
British Prime Minister Gordon Brown there with a big offer, as he said, for the world. In a moment, the godfather of the modern Green movement, James Lovelock, after the news headlines.